Hey everyone, I know this is out of the ordinary for the channel considering I cover many action games or video games that aren't very narrative driven, and I have said this a lot in the past since many games nowadays don't necessarily focus on themselves being an actual video game. Completely different topic for another day, but this is an exception considering how Life is Strange was a big part of my life growing up during my teenage years. This was a very different game at its time when it was first released. Its narrative was very unique with discussions and themes of time travel, and this was when all the Telltale-like and other story-driven games were booming. When I was graciously offered a code by Square Enix, and knowing this is a sequel to the first Life is Strange game, I had to take it and give this opportunity to myself to talk about it with you all. I haven't personally gotten into the other Life is Strange games, not because they were bad, I was just simply not interested in them, especially how the first Life is Strange game gave me a great connection with the cast of characters, and them not continuing Max Caulfield's story kind of bummed me out until they announced this past summer during the Xbox Game Showcase of Max returning in Life is Strange Double Exposure. I was pretty surprised they decided to bring her back since it has been a little over 9 years since we last saw her. This honestly made my experience of the sequel much better considering how I was returning to this franchise with a character who is much more grown up now, like how I am, but it's also the fact that Max comes into my life whenever I am in a new phase of my life. Back then, her character appeared during my teenage years, just like her starting the academy. And now that she is grown, she comes back learning a lot about her adulthood as she works in a university, which is very similar to what I'm currently going through. It's just such a coincidence how she always appears in important phases in my life, so this playthrough has a huge significance on me. For this review, I will do my best to be spoiler free. There may be moments where I may talk about minor spoilers, but nothing to where I'll be revealing the whole story or important plot twist of the game. With games like this, it is difficult to discuss when being spoiler free since the nature of the game is heavily story driven, and I do not know everyone's tolerance when it comes to minor spoilers, so please be aware of what you will be watching even though this is a spoiler-free video. Since this is a sequel as well, I will be discussing the endings of the first Life is Strange, so if you do plan on playing the first game, I highly recommend you leave this video and come back whenever you finish that game. If you're not interested in playing the first game, I hope you find this review as informative since I will talk about if this game can be played by a newcomer. I also want to note that I haven't seen any promotions of this game before its release. I only read online that Max Caulfield was returning to this new Life is Strange game, so keep in mind that this review is coming from someone who had no context or expectations of this game. I did see the reception and backlash this game has taken from the media along with its fan base. I honestly found that surprising, but there are maybe things I'm not aware of with everyone else. Regardless, I hope you guys enjoy this review coming from someone who hasn't played this series in 9 years, so let's get right to it. To give an introduction to this game, it takes place 10 years after the incident of Blackwell Academy in Arcadia Bay. We have now a much older and wiser Max Caulfield has sworn to never use her powers again as she enters a new life. For context, in the first game, she had discovered a power that could rewind time. There were many events in the academy that she enrolled in, and undoing these events showed a lot of consequences which have traumatized her then, and she remains to cope and fight this trauma in Double Exposure. As she has moved on with her life, she has also ended up in a new place. She became a resident at Lakeport, Vermont, and is a photographer for a prestigious college called Calden University. Along this new life, she has met new friends, which all have different personalities to them, and has a best friend named Sophie. On one mysterious night, strange things started to happen with Max Caulfield, and as she was heading back home, she saw her best friend dead on the floor as she was shot in the chest with no trace of the murderer to be found. This became another difficult journey for Max as she starts to solve this mystery in Calden University. As she is trying to find clues about her friend's death, she discovers another supernatural ability she has obtained where she's able to go through two different timelines. A timeline where her best friend Sophie is still alive, while the other is the current timeline of where she is dead. With Max's determination and the experiences she has had, this is another incredibly different mystery she has to solve. The game's story has a big theme on the impact of choices, which all Life is Strange games are about. You as a player have to encounter these riveting decisions on what you think is right or what you should do for the moment. This game does not disappoint when it comes to that, and it works well with the game because Max has to go through a lot of difficult decisions. Before I talk about how I feel about the story, let's get into the gameplay, graphics, and performance. This was Deck 9's first time using the Unreal Engine 5 for the series, and it was said by the director John Stoddard that using this engine helped a lot with animations and visual fidelity. It was a huge leap for them to go through, and it was clearly one of the first things I noticed since I'm only used to seeing Life is Strange back in 2015. To see their visuals be quite vibrant, have great lighting alongside be detailed with a lot of their models in game, it was a dream come true to see not only Max return, but to my eyes a whole visual revamp of Life is Strange. I was very fortunate enough to play this on PC on its max graphic settings, which is the cinematic preset. It was very marvelous to look at, especially for games like this that focus on storytelling, that rely on environment and facial expressions. The only gameplay experiences that had flaws was them not providing a save point during the game. You would have to rely on their autosave checkpoints, which isn't as convenient considering how lengthy these chapters are. I also had a few crashes with the game, which led me to replay certain segments that take some time to go through. Another issue was that you weren't able to skip dialogue and cutscenes. I do understand why it wasn't initially provided, but scenarios where I was forced to replay segments because of the crashes was obnoxious to go through. Also, if players do want to replay the game and see certain things, they should be provided this life quality change instead of completely forcing them to watch everything. I hope they could actually add this as a future update. The next issue I did face was with audio. I'm not sure if this was on the engine side of things or whether it was the game, but audio was weird when it comes to projecting voices from a certain distance or angle. Sometimes gameplay dialogue from a character sounded far away even though they were right in front of you, and voice acting audio gets awkwardly loud at times. Other than that, there weren't any game-breaking bugs or issues for me, and the game ran fine throughout my whole first playthrough. I was surprised for a game that looks like this. It ran over 90 to 110 frames on my build using the AMD Ryzen 9 7900X CPU and with Nvidia's GPU, the 4070 Super. I'm not quite sure how other platforms such as consoles may run this game. My build is quite different compared to the average PC user, so feel free to share your experience in the comment section. Overall, I just think the game needs some fixing and adding minor life quality changes for people to fully enjoy this experience, but it's a solid game so far. What was unique about the first Life is Strange is that Max's gameplay ability was to rewind time, so that includes the events of what she goes through in the story. What was intriguing about this mechanic was that you were able to experience so many different scenarios within one segment of the story. This also fit the theme of accepting the choices that were given to you, whether it was you, the player, or Max Caulfield. Now, for Double Exposure, she no longer has this ability, and now she has a whole different ability to shift into different timelines. With current technology, this allowed the level design to be more interesting. All within the gameplay, the developers made you able to navigate not just one map, but two. The level designers did this so that when gathering clues or examining the current area you are in, you're able to find out these secrets without going through the hassle of loading in through areas. Another cool idea that was implemented was using the other timeline to help the other. So Max goes constantly in between these timelines and gets certain items or information to help people wherever they are at. Although this all sounds confusing, once you get to play it, it makes sense and shows how genius and how much effort was put in their gameplay, even though this is a game that heavily leans on story. Another big feature that was implemented in this game is that Max has the ability to temporarily see the other timeline within whatever timeline she is in. It works like a sixth sense or having another vision, similar to how Geralt in The Witcher 3 investigates clues. It's just that for her, it involves much more complexity in timelines. This feature helps her look into clues in an in-depth manner or gather information much more easily, since she has the ability to hear conversations from the other timeline without people knowing, able to compare and contrast these timelines, whether they are similar or can lead to the same outcome. This works extraordinarily well with the murder mystery of what they have written, and Max does her best to connect the puzzle pieces as she tries to make sense of everything. She is just as lost as a player, which created this this immersion in the gameplay to be as engaging, since you are put in many scenarios to figure out and connect all the dots to this story. There are probably more nice little touches that the gameplay has provided for the player on which I can't think of at the moment, but I was really impressed with how everything was set up. I know it has been a while since I've experienced a genre like this. It's genuinely surprising to me that it's actually not as linear as I would expect, which is not a bad thing at all. I encourage games to be open in some shape or form. Although the gameplay experience was great for the most part, what was questionable is how the content was handled with certain editions. Now, I was very blessed by Square Enix for them to give me the Ultimate Edition of Life is Strange. It comes with 3 editions on release. There's your Standard, Deluxe, and Ultimate. Although the content provided throughout each of these editions isn't as drastic and doesn't really affect the main story, I just don't think the players should be gatekept by quote-unquote small quest lines in these games. They only provide a little quest line throughout the game, which involves Max Caulfield and a cat. It's a very cute little story that Deck 9 has added for the game, which is only exclusive if you purchase the game for $80, which is the Ultimate Edition. I thought this would be a bit important to note if you ever make a purchase, because I know people can feel a bit left out on experiencing things in a video game. I also know that on the other hand, it's not that much of a big deal, and enjoying just the base game itself is completely fine. And although Ultimate Edition gives small content for the story, they also give bonus attires for Max to wear throughout the game, which I thought was pretty cool. One of them was based on Final Fantasy VII, which the outfits of that do not disappoint at all. With all that being said, I do think purchasing the Ultimate Edition for another $30 is a bit pricey. I really would want them to have an option to purchase the DLC individually rather than being locked through these editions. Again, if I was the customer, I wouldn't be bothered by this, especially if the questline isn't much content to consume, nor does it make it a big change to the story. I just wanted to note this since some people have different opinions when it comes to microtransactions or paid DLC. Now, onto the story and how I feel about it. As I previously mentioned, this is my first Life is Strange game after 9 years, so to return with a character I was once familiar with will show a lot of my bias and how much I really enjoyed this. I thought this was a great sequel for me where I left off with Max's story. I would personally say that this story is much more focused on the narrative than the characters if we were comparing this from the first game. The first really was heavy on the cast and its chemistry with the player or Max herself. I know some people may feel different coming into Double Exposure since they sort of lack that. I'm not saying the characters are not as intriguing compared to the first, because honestly I thought the characters were good to understand when they express themselves through these chapters. I just don't think everyone would exactly feel the same about every single character, since some don't have a big purpose for the plot and rather they are there for small details of the main narrative. There are clearly other characters in this game that have the limelight and have much more depth to them. Again, I'm not as confident if people would find them as interesting since these characters are much older, more relaxed, or serious. The small details of their personalities got me interested in how they were portrayed since it was a bit realistic on how adults deal with their livelihood. I think it's appropriate for Double Exposure to create a mature narrative for Max along with the other characters and its environment, especially because she's much older than before and her audience has grown up as well. So as someone like myself who was in high school when I was first exposed to the Life is Strange series, it only makes sense that this game particularly aims to have this sense of maturity. I have read up on some reviews on Steam on how the general audience feels about it, and it's sort of mixed. There were complaints about how the game runs, but for the most part people feel that Double Exposure didn't hit the same level with them compared to the first game, which is completely valid. I feel like stories like this are hard to please everyone, and I have not experienced the other Life is Strange games, so my standards and expectations, you could say, are pretty low for the most part. All I could say is that this game did give me the same feeling when I first experienced Max's first game. I want to say this again, that I'm not big on these type of games, and I only made an exception to play this because I was familiar with Max's story from a decade ago. I would say the experience is still on par from what I went through in 2015. I always felt decisions that the players chooses were always important, and I was always interested in what would happen next. Typically, I would doze off with other games when there's a lot of story just shoved right in front of my face, but I always felt that this game gave me a reason to engage with it due to my curiosity and interest. Another little review I read from the others is that people didn't enjoy this as much because it was a murder mystery, but I always felt that Life is Strange is very focused on the mystery genre, so I wasn't surprised that this game became a murder mystery for its main narrative. Without referencing the first game though, just speaking on the story itself for Double Exposure, I felt that the murder mystery mixed with the supernatural fiction is the reason why I stayed playing the game. It was also the little moments throughout these chapters of knowing the place and its people. It has that nice slice of life just like the previous game. I think this game is more grounded to a certain extent, but that's the charm of it. The mix of these grounded characters along with the heavy fiction about Max and her supernatural abilities really does its job to create interest on what will happen next. A lot of its story can go over your head when it involves the character's adulthood and their characterization behind it. I think this is why I appreciate this game a lot, because of how I could see the psychology behind all that and understand them on a human level as I currently go through particular problems as I'm aging too, like the cast. The only problems I did have with the story was how the beginning of the game determined my playthrough for certain details of the entirety of the game. There are clearly big decisions in your first playthrough where they are important and make you go through these different scenarios depending what choice you make. As someone who came in blind and knew nothing of how this game mechanically worked, this scenario in the beginning of the game where Sophie brought up Chloe and asked who she was to Max, the game gave you two options to answer this, and it was clear that this was an important decision to make considering the visuals and scene froze to make you think through it. This was the time where I thought this would only apply for dialogue and not your entire playthrough or a change in a different path in your playthrough, but these options pretty much determine what ending you got from the first Life is Strange game, where Chloe dies or the whole town of Arcadia dies. And we'll continue this backstory for Max in Double Exposure. I made Max tell Sophie that Chloe and her are sweethearts. Again, I had no clue this would determine a big outcome, and I assumed this scenario would show Max's personality when she talks about Chloe as sweethearts, because the ending I was familiar with was Chloe dying. I thought if I picked the dialogue of her and Chloe being sweethearts, it shows that Max wasn't comfortable talking about her death at the moment. Instead, they gave the Max I knew a change in her backstory, which was brought up throughout the game, and I was confused when I started to see Chloe on Max's phone when it came to their social media or memories with Chloe that I wasn't familiar with when Max was talking about them. This isn't necessarily the game developer's fault. I completely understand why they decided to do this considering their first game had two endings. This is why I really wanted a skip option for its cutscenes and dialogue. I would have had more incentive to redo my playthrough than keep going with it. What was a bit off-putting about having a playthrough that has the Save Chloe ending in Double Exposure is that although I never had that ending in the first game, I thought it was completely weird that they just wrote that Max and Chloe just broke up and went their own separate ways. That just doesn't seem believable for both of these characters that have extremely strong connections with each other coming from the first game. It just seems that the other ending makes much more sense to have than the Chloe ending, which is problematic for players that experience that. Having to save Chloe and getting into Double Exposure where these characters don't necessarily have a closure for the audience is a bit disappointing to say the least, which leads me to the next topic. Another slight issue I had is how things are a bit brushed over when it comes to their characters, including Max. An example I could bring up is that Max is apparently a teacher, and you notice clearly because some students you interact with call her Miss Caulfield. It was mentioned by her that she was not really a teacher. I just didn't have much context to that. Not that it was necessarily important for the main narrative to have, but it definitely would have been a nice touch to her character, especially of what she went through in the past from her former high school teacher. It will really show the big comparisons of how great and sincere a teacher she is. If anything, I wouldn't necessarily say she felt like a student on campus during Double Exposure, but her job was more on the freelance side where she kind of did whatever she wanted on her terms, which they did describe and show little details that focus on her photography career throughout the chapters. Regardless, it would have been nice to have some visual or context of Max teaching a classroom. I do have a reason why I think some story bits may not hit to some, but that goes into spoiler territory, so we'll not be discussing this today. I do believe that if you are new to the series, I don't actually think you would need a lot of context to understand Max's perspective along with her backstory. I do somewhat consider this a soft reboot for her series, since this is pretty much a reset from all the things she has gone through and she's now living a whole new life. This is a different version of Max compared to her first game when she was completely younger. There were plenty of times where she recapped a lot of her memories from the first game when you examine items or explore around. Like what I previously mentioned, the experience coming back to this franchise gave me that same feeling when I first played Life is Strange, so I can only imagine a newcomer sitting down and playing this for the first time. I do still recommend you get into her first game, especially how they have a remastered version, but if you just want to get right into it, I don't think there should be a huge problem. So overall, I have enjoyed my experience. I'm most likely the minority on this, but it was a treat to come back to the series. If you are new, I do recommend you wait a bit until it goes on sale, or you wait for a few more life quality updates for the game. Other than that, it's a good holiday game to sit down and play. I was really snuggled up and just enjoying what the story had offered. I don't know, maybe it's just me and I'm a sucker for games that have holiday spirit in them. I also do want to know your problems with the game if you have ever played it, but I know this is a difficult thing to describe on a spoiler-free video. I would like the comments to be spoiler-free, but if you have anything to say about the game, whether you did really enjoy it or not, feel free to comment. I do want to tap in with how the current Life is Strange players feel with one of the most iconic characters returning to this game. Again, it has been such a long time for me since I initially played this franchise, so my expectations are low to say the least. Anyway, remember to drop a like and subscribe. Thank you again for those who remain to support the channel, and I hope to see you all in the next upcoming videos and streams. Thank you for the support on the recent reviews. Hope everyone has a good one, and happy holidays.